The rain in Seattle that afternoon in 1964 was a relentless, cold mist that blurred the neon signs of the waterfront into shimmering smears of red and blue. Inside a small, cramped diner tucked between a hardware store and a boarding house, the air was thick with the smell of old grease, hemp wool, and the low hum of a jukebox that had seen better decades. The linoleum floor was scuffed gray, and the windows were fogged over, sealing the occupants in a world of muted sounds and flickering fluorescent light. In a corner booth, away from the drafty door, a young man sat with his back to the wall. He was lean, dressed in a dark, functional jacket, his hair cut in a neat, short style. He wasn't doing anything remarkable. He was just drinking tea. His name was Bruce Lee, and at 23 years old, he was a man who had turned his body into a laboratory for human potential. He sat with a stillness that was unusual for a busy public space, a relaxed, alert posture that allowed him to see everything in the room without focusing on anything in particular. The door swung open with a heavy thud, and the bell above it rattled violently. A group of men walked in, bringing with them a gust of freezing air and the scent of wet asphalt. The leader of the group was a man named Miller, a sergeant who had recently returned from a tour of duty. He was a massive individual, standing well over 6 feet tall and weighing at least 230 pounds. His frame was thick, his neck corded with muscle, and his face carried the hard, weathered look of a man accustomed to enforcing his will through size. He was loud and clearly agitated, his voice booming over the quiet murmur of the other patrons. He and his friends moved toward the back of the diner, their heavy boots thumping on the floorboards. As Miller passed Bruce's booth, the space was narrow. A normal person would have adjusted their gait, but Miller didn't. He intentionally leaned his massive shoulder into Bruce, slamming into the smaller man with enough force to shove his torso against the wall. The impact caused Bruce's cup to tip, and hot tea splashed across his hand and onto the wooden table. The diner went silent. The only sound was the faint sizzle of the grill and the rain tapping against the glass. Miller didn't keep walking. He stopped and turned, looking down at Bruce with a smirk that was more of a challenge than an apology. He was waiting for a reaction, for a sign of fear or a clumsy outburst of anger. Bruce didn't jump up. He didn't swear. He moved with a terrifyingly slow, methodical precision, picking up a napkin and wiping the tea from his skin. His eyes remained on the table for a moment, then he slowly lifted them to meet Miller's gaze. There was no heat in Bruce's eyes, only a cold, analytical focus. He told Miller quietly that the table was stationary and that Miller was the one who lacked control over his own momentum. The words were like a spark in a dry forest. Miller's face flushed a deep, angry red. He reached down, gripped the edge of the heavy table, and shoved it with a sudden, violent burst of strength, pinning Bruce into the booth. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and aggression, and asked what Bruce was going to do about it. Bruce didn't panic. He shifted his weight, sliding out from behind the pin table with a fluid, liquid grace that made it look as though the furniture wasn't even there. He stood in the aisle, his feet spaced slightly apart, his center of gravity low. He wasn't in a fighting stance from a movie, he just looked ready. Miller, seeing the smaller man stand his ground, threw a heavy, wide-arcing punch aimed directly at Bruce's head. This was the start of the 10 seconds that would redefine Miller's understanding of violence. The first second was a lesson in the principle of interception. As Miller's fist began its arc, Bruce didn't step back to block. He stepped forward, deep into Miller's personal space. Before the soldier's punch had even traveled half its distance, Bruce's lead hand shot out like a spring-loaded piston. He didn't hit with a closed fist, he used his fingers, flicking them toward Miller's eyes, a movement known as Jeet. He didn't make contact, but the sheer speed and the sudden appearance of fingers inches from his pupils caused Miller's nervous system to react reflexively. Miller's eyelids snapped shut, and his head jerked back, throwing his entire body out of alignment. His big punch whistled harmlessly through the air where Bruce's head had been a fraction of a second before. In the second and third seconds, Bruce exploited the opening. Miller was blind and off balance. Bruce's lead foot, his right, slid forward and stepped on the inside of Miller's lead foot. This was a tactical pinning of the base. At the same time, Bruce used his left forearm to jam Miller's right arm, which was still extended from the missed punch. By pressing against the bicep, Bruce prevented Miller from pulling the arm back to strike again. Miller was now structurally locked. He was a massive man, but he was being held in place by a series of micropressures. Bruce's right hand, which had just flicked at the eyes, retracted only a few inches before exploding forward again. This time, it was a vertical punch, delivered with the bottom 3 knuckles, aimed directly at the solar plexus. The 4th second was the sound of air leaving a body. The punch didn't look like much, it only traveled about 5 inches, but it was powered by the rotation of Bruce's hips and the sudden tensing of his entire skeletal structure at the moment of impact. Miller's diaphragm spasmed instantly. His face went from red to a sickly pale gray as his lungs refused to take in air. He began to double over, his torso dropping toward Bruce. In the 5th and 6th seconds, Bruce transitioned into a series of rapid-fire, chain punches. These were not long, looping blows, they were short, rhythmic strikes that landed like a jackhammer on Miller's chest and ribs. Thud 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 thud. Each strike was designed to keep Miller's nervous system in a state of constant shock, preventing his brain from sending a signal to his muscles to fight back. By the 7th second, Miller was in total collapse. He tried to use his weight to fall on Bruce, a desperate attempt to use gravity as a weapon. Bruce sensed the shift in weight before it even happened. He didn't try to catch the falling giant. He stepped to the side at a 45-degree angle, caught Miller's wrist, and added his own pulling force to Miller's downward momentum. This was the physics of the lever and the fulcrum. Miller didn't just fall, he was accelerated toward the floor. As he tumbled, Bruce delivered a sharp, snapping kick to the outside of Miller's thigh, right above the knee. It wasn't a bone-breaking blow, but it struck a major nerve cluster, causing Miller's leg to go completely numb and useless. The 8th and 9th seconds were a study in absolute control. Miller hit the floor on one knee, gasping, his hands scraping the linoleum as he tried to stay upright. He was dazed, his vision was blurry, and his chest felt like it had been hit by a wrecking ball. He looked up, his mouth open in a silent cry for air, and saw Bruce standing right in front of him. Bruce's right fist was cocked back near his own waist, then it moved. It was a blur that the human eye could barely track. The fist stopped exactly 1 inch from Miller's nose. The force of the sudden stop created a visible puff of air that blew Miller's hair back. Bruce's entire body was locked in a perfect, rigid line of power, from his back heel through his spine to his knuckles. If he had followed through, the bridge of Miller's nose would have been driven into his skull. The 10th second was the silence. Bruce held the fist there for a heartbeat, allowing Miller to look down the barrel of the weapon that had just spared his life. Then, Bruce slowly opened his hand, letting his fingers relax. He stepped back, returning to the same calm, unassuming posture he had held while drinking his tea. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just solved a simple math problem. Miller sat on the floor, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. He looked at his friends, who were frozen by the door, and then back at the small man who had just dismantled him, the efficiency of a surgeon. The realization hit Miller that in those 10 seconds, his size, his rank, and his strength had meant absolutely nothing. He had been fighting a force of nature that understood his own body better than he did. The diner remained silent for several more seconds. The jukebox finally reached the end of a record, and the mechanical click of the changer sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Bruce walked back to his booth. The table was still crooked, and the spilled tea was still there. He took a few coins from his pocket, placed them on the table to pay for the mess, and picked up his jacket. He didn't say a word to Miller. He didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered in a language that transcended words, the language of physical reality. As Bruce walked toward the door, the other soldiers instinctively stepped aside, giving him a wide, respectful path. They didn't look at him with malice, they looked at him with the kind of awe people reserve for things they don't understand. Bruce pushed the door open and stepped out into the Seattle rain. The cool air felt good against his skin. He didn't feel like a hero or a victor, he felt the internal critique of his own performance. He thought about the third punch, his elbow had been a fraction of an inch too high. He thought about the transition to the leg kick, his weight shift could have been smoother. For Bruce, the fight wasn't an end in itself, it was just more data for his journey toward perfection. Behind him, inside the diner, the atmosphere slowly began to thaw. The fry cook went back to his grill, but his hands were shaking as he flipped a burger. The old man at the counter finally turned the page of his newspaper, though he wasn't reading the words. Miller eventually found his feet. He was slow and clumsy, his body aching in ways he hadn't thought possible. His friends helped him to a chair, but he sat there in silence for a long time, staring at the empty booth in the corner. He touched his ribs, then his nose, feeling the phantom impact of the blow that hadn't landed. He had spent his whole life believing that being the biggest and the strongest made him the master of his environment. In 10 seconds, that entire worldview had been shattered. He didn't feel the urge to go find the man and get revenge. He felt a strange, quiet sense of gratitude that the man had been as disciplined as he was fast. If Bruce Lee had been a man of lesser character, Miller knew he wouldn't be sitting in that chair. The story of the soldier and the teacher would eventually spread through the martial arts schools of the Northwest, and later across the world. It would be told and retold, sometimes with exaggerations, sometimes as a myth. But the witnesses who were there that day knew the truth was much simpler. There were no flashy kicks, no loud screams, and no cinematic drama. There was only a collision between ego and expertise. Miller had brought his muscles and his anger to the fight, but Bruce had brought the laws of physics and a mind that was as clear as a mountain spring. As the years passed, Bruce Lee would become a name synonymous with power, but he always maintained that the greatest strength was the strength to remain soft until the moment of impact. He taught that being like water meant being able to flow around an obstacle or crash through it, depending on the need. That afternoon in Seattle, Miller had been the rock, and Bruce had been the water. The rock had been unmovable until the water showed it how to fall. The diner eventually closed down, and the people who were there moved on, but the image of the young man in the dark jacket remained etched in their minds. The real power of that encounter wasn't in the punches that landed, but in the one that didn't. It was the one-inch punch that never connected, the ultimate statement of restraint. It showed that the most dangerous man is not the one who wants to destroy his enemy, but the one who has the absolute power to do so and chooses to show them a better way. Miller never bullied anyone in a cafe again. He became a student of the memory of those 10 seconds, realizing that true mastery isn't about dominance over others, but about the absolute, unwavering mastery of oneself. And in the end, that was the only lesson Bruce Lee ever really wanted to teach. The rain continued to fall on Seattle long after Bruce had gone, a relentless, rhythmic drumming against the tin roofs and the cracked pavement of the waterfront. It was a cold, cleansing downpour that sought to wash away the physical traces of what had transpired, the muddy footprints of heavy combat boots, the cooling splashes of spilled tea, and the faint, metallic scent of adrenaline that had hung so thick in the air. But inside the small diner, the atmosphere remained stubbornly charged. The space felt altered, as if the molecular structure of the room had been rearranged by the sheer intensity of those 10 seconds. The patrons remained in their seats, their voices reduced to low, reverent whispers, eyes continually drifting back to the empty corner booth where the young man had sat. The silence there was no longer just the absence of noise, it was a presence in itself, a heavy, resonant vacuum left behind by a force they could not quite aim. Miller, the man who had been the mountain only moments before, remained seated in a chair his friends had pulled out for him. He was a man physically intact, yet internally dismantled. As the initial shock began to fade, a different kind of pain began to set in, not the sharp sting of a wound, but a deep, throbbing ache in his nervous system, the echo of a total systemic overload. He looked down at his hands, those massive, callous tools of war that had served him so well in every brawl and every battlefield, and for the first time in his life, they felt heavy and alien. He realized that his strength had been his cage, He had relied so much on the density of his muscle and the weight of his frame that he had become rigid, a static object in a world governed by motion. He thought of the young man's fist, that terrifyingly still point of power just an inch from his face, and he felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the Seattle chill. He understood now that he hadn't just lost a fight, he had witnessed a higher form of existence, a way of being that didn't require the noise of aggression or the display of dominance. When Miller finally stood to leave, his movements were cautious, devoid of the arrogant swagger he had entered with. He navigated the furniture of the diner with a newfound awareness, a sudden, sharp realization that every object had its own center of gravity, its own right to occupy space. As he stepped out into the night, the rain hitting his face felt different. It was no longer an inconvenience to be cursed, but a reminder of the fluidity he had just seen. He walked away not as a defeated bully, but as a man who had been given a glimpse of the truth. He would never speak of that night with bitterness. Instead, he would spend years trying to explain to other men that the most dangerous person in the world is not one who screams the loudest, but the one who can move through the world like a ghost, leaving no trace but the memory of a perfection they can never reach. Meanwhile, Bruce Lee navigated the gray, mist-shrouded streets with a steady, effortless pace. His dark jacket was zipped tight against the dampness, and he walked with a slight, rhythmic bounce that suggested a body in perfect harmony with the ground beneath it. To the sailors and dockworkers he passed, he was just another young man, another face in the crowd of a city that didn't yet know his name. But inside him, a different kind of labor was taking place. Bruce wasn't celebrating his victory, he was performing a cold, clinical autopsy of the encounter. In his mind's eye, he replayed the 10 seconds in slow motion, frame by frame, analyzing the micromechanics of every shift and weight. He critiqued the angle of his lead foot during the interception, wondering if a 3-degree adjustment would have yielded a more efficient pivot. He felt the phantom sensation of the 1-inch punch and calculated the exact moment of tension release in his hips, searching for the tiny, invisible friction that prevented it from being even more direct. He was a man who lived at the center of the storm, a place of absolute stillness where the winds of ego and fear could not reach. For Bruce, the fight in the diner was not an event of personal pride, it was an experiment in the laboratory of life. He had tested the laws of physics against the reality of human aggression, and the results had been recorded in his muscles. As he walked past the flickering neon signs of the bars and the dull glow of the street lamps, he felt the fire of his discipline burning with a white-hot intensity. It was a flame fed by a singular purpose, the total integration of mind, body, and spirit. He didn't want to be a fighter, he wanted to be the embodiment of the way, a living expression of the principle that truth has no fixed form. He saw the city not as a place of streets and buildings, but as a landscape of energy and resistance, and he moved through it like water, finding the path of least resistance while remaining capable of crushing anything that tried to contain him. The legend of that night would grow, passing through the maritime unions, the military barracks, and the back-alley dojos of the Pacific Northwest, eventually becoming a cornerstone of the myth that would surround him. People would argue over the details, adding flourishes of cinematic magic, claiming he moved faster than light or that he had used some secret, ancient power. But the reality was both simpler and more profound. It was the day a soldier met a dragon and realized that the world was much bigger, and much more mysterious, than he had ever imagined. The dragon didn't need to roar to be felt, it didn't need to burn the world down to prove its fire. It simply needed to be. In its presence, the illusions of size and strength evaporated, leaving behind only the raw, naked truth of skill and intent.